let's talk about Ulysses, chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7, 8, 9 today. But one thing I really want to do, I'm going to step aside from the lecture and give a little bit of context today, because on our forum on Friday, I realized there was a big question from the middle of the room, which was then a different location because of the shape of the room, about the nature of modernism. Question was, you said modernism by arguments. How would Don Quixote, Goethe, those from underground not modernists? So let me give you some facts about literary modernism. I realize I haven't done this. One thing, fractured perspective. This is something we've seen before. But this is something that when I was reading the Times Literary Supplement today in an article about J.R.R. Tolkien, apparently you know that his son, Chris Tolkien, thank you very much, by the way, Factor. That was like the opposite of what I thought you were doing. I thought you were walking out. I was like, that's okay, whatever. But then he closed the door. That's great. So, and I have actually seen people lurk back there and listen before too. It's kind of funny. I don't know. I feel sort of pleased when someone does that. I'm like, I must have said something interesting. But in any case, fracture perspective. Here are some other important details. Between, remember this means between, like RT means relation, like WD means withdraw. Between World War I and World War II. Okay. This is an embarrassing question. I'm not going to ask you to bear up. How many of you can tell me for a fact you do not know the dates of World War I and World War II? Okay, good. No, this is good. Probably the Civil War too, the American Civil War. World War I, 1914 to 1918, loosely defined. Sometimes people will really go into the granular details and say, well, really, World War I starting around 1912, and it's more America's perspective that it starts in 1940. Fine. Think really granularly about that in your history class. World War II, 1941, 1945. But remember that Hitler was first elected, I think, in 1933. So the National Socialists had a lot of time to really develop what it is that they were doing. Modernism occurs between these times in the what is called the interbellum period. So you may have heard of an intermezzo. Intermezzo means literally the exact same thing as intermediary. Mezzo means middle in Italian. Bellum in Latin looks sort of like bella, which means beautiful. And yet bellum means war. Etymologically, they must come from very different words. And yet, I don't know. There's something there. One thing I will tell you is that the god of war and the god of lust/love, but the Roman and the Greek traditions fall in love with each other. Ares and Aphrodite are the Greek names. Venus and Mars are the Roman names. Okay, what else about these figures? Often live abroad. Like I told you, James Joyce lived in Paris, he's Irish, for 20 years. What's the big difference between Paris and Britain and Ireland? What's the biggest difference you can think of besides a geographic one? Think about if you were going to move to Paris, what the biggest issue would be if you were not Emily in Paris. The language, right? You have to speak a totally different language. Imagine every interaction you have, every day, every friendship you have is mitigated by this language that is not your own. Now, Joyce knew French well, and he learned it in his sort of upper school. And there are many English. He was not technically English. He was Irish, but he was British because, Britain is England, but with Wales, Ireland, and Scotland as well. And the Scottish, the Welsh, the Irish maintain their ethnic identities, their national identities. And so if one wants to put one's foot in one's mouth or one's foot in it to be even more vulgar, a good thing to do is to like see a Welshman and be like, oh, are you Irish? Or to see a Scottish person and ask if they're English. Usually they don't get like mad at you, but it's sort of a disappointing moment, though somebody could get mad. So fractured perspective exists between the times of World War I, World War II. The authors themselves live abroad. So James Joyce lived in France for 20 years. Thomas Mann, himself a German speaker from Germany, lived in California in English-speaking America for many years. Other figures that we will be reading, besides Thomas Mann and James Joyce, are Virginia Woolf, writer of Mrs. Dalloway. Do note that her name is spelled a little differently from what you might expect, knowing about wolves. Also figures like Ezra Pound, who was one of the major figures, and you may hate him for this, who attempted to get Ulysses published. He seemed to have a gift for having other greater writers shine to their greatest potential. One interesting thing about him is he got really into a time in fascism and was later not exiled from America, but would live in Italy. And unlike Thomas Mann, who was on the right side of history when it came to acting against the Nazis, we usually consider Ezra Pound sort of somebody who, despite his great literary influence, gave into cultural political forces that we consider terrible in their effect. This is similar to a German philosopher from that time named Martin Heidegger, with a very famous work called Sein und Zeit, Being and Time. He also he threw in his lot with the prevailing political party of the Nazis at the time. And so even though he was a great metaphysician and philosopher, something that we remember about him were his political tastes. And so a few things to keep in mind about modernism. Fracture perspective truly happens during the 1920s or so, 1918 to 1933, but the short interbellum, there we go. I want to say antebellum. When you talk about the American Civil War, you often talk about the antebellum times. Those are the pre-war times. And then often these characters, these people were not nationalists, but cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan comes from the Greek word cosmos, which means world, which originally meant arrangement. That's why we have the studies of cosmology, just the study of the heavens. Astrophysicists study cosmology. But then we also have the study of, maybe you really like makeup, know the other word I'm thinking of without even saying it? Cosmetology, right. And so the great joke for someone like me, or cosmetics, also the art of arrangement. So arrange the stars and arrange the face. Is that the great joke is someone like me says, oh, I'm a cosmologist at a nail salon, and the person there says, so am I, I'm a cosmetologist. And you kind of joke to yourselves about that. So these seem like very different professions, but they are rooted in the same word. Polis, excuse me, from which we got the word politics, originally meant city-state. So like cosmopolitan means a citizen of the world. And so this is the opposite of someone who is nationalist, who is a citizen of one's nation. And these are opposing ideologies to one another. So one can see that these authors live in different places, who often write in differing languages from those that they were raised in, are people that believe in trying to be something like a world citizen rather than a nationalist. One thing I will say about cosmopolitanism, as noble and ideal as it is there is no legal status to be citizen of the world. Whereas the vast majority of nation states, there are some legal processes by which one determines one's citizenship. So cosmopolitanism remains more of a way of being, way of thinking than perhaps an identity quite as rooted as nationalism. Though when you hear nationalism thrown around these days, it's usually thrown around pejoratively. Like somebody is called a nationalist if they only care about the good of their nation at the expense of other nations. Is more of a pejorative way of putting it. But the term itself originally is just used in this contradistinction to being cosmopolitan. Something you might think about is, did these cosmopolitans fail or succeed? Or have they failed or succeeded in the last 100 years or so? Something interesting. All right, I said a few things about modernism. I wanted to say a few things about modernism, just so you know what is generally called modern by definition, not by argument, as I made in the first half of the course. Let's jump into chapter 3 of Ulysses quickly so that we can start to see really what it is that this young intellectual mind of Stephen can do. So in the first chapter, we saw the Black Mass and the breakfast with Buck Mulligan and the Englishman Haynes, as well as the nice Irish milkmaid who could not speak Irish, but thought that, in fact, Irish spoken by Haynes, the Englishman, was French. We then moved to Dalkey, about 6 miles down the coast from the Martello Tower, where Stephen gave a lesson on a Pyrrhic victory, the Greek general Pyrrhus, and then also on a great English poem by John Milton about a friend of his who had died, I think even drowned, called Lycidas. Keep in mind, drowning and death. These come up again and again. They come up again and again, even in chapter 3. Proteus and the shifting sands. Here we see the figure of a dead dog, a living dog, who himself, like Proteus, who has many shifting forms, described as a hare, as a dog, as several other animals, finds the bloated corpse of a dead dog. This leads Stephen to think about the dead man who washed up on the shore, something like 7 to 9 days before that. And when he thinks about that, he thinks about, could he save a man? He's afraid of the water. And he thinks about being dragged under the water. And then he starts to think about his mother again. He starts to think about her own death as he's walking along the beach. You might think that that's a pretty safe place to walk. And yet something that James Joyce may make the claim of to you is that as a cerebral creature capable of making connections, there's really no safe place for you. There's no way to get away from your giant, as Ralph Waldo Emerson says. He says that in Self-Reliance, he says that traveling is a fool's errand. Even wherever you go, your giant goes with you. And so, in any case, we find that to be true with Stephen Dedalus here. He's trying to get away from it all. And yet, he somehow transforms the situation into a very similar situation as those he's seen before today. A situation where he finds himself ruminating about his mother. There seems to be something unresolved there. It comes up again and again and again. And so perhaps our hypothesis for young Stephen would be, if we happen to be his friends and to talk to him through time and through media and from fact to fiction, would be, maybe you need to take a minute and think about what happened between you and your mother. Maybe you need to talk to somebody too, but that seems to be the problem. Who is it that Stephen is going to talk to? His own father? No, his father doesn't seem to understand him very well. When he thinks about him in his own mind, he thinks about his father making fun of Richie Goulding, who is his uncle, husband to his Aunt Sally. And he thinks about his father's capacity for mimicry, for imitating. And so he thinks about, this is all him thinking this. He thinks about, as he walks near his Aunt Sally's house, his father making fun of his Aunt Sally and their stuttering child to his own children while talking about Stephen. Pretty advanced imaginary display, and in fact even includes like the rude stuttering that his father would be imitating at that moment. Okay, so this is a weird chapter. Let me tell you a little bit about the Homeric antecedents. Proteus in book 4 out of 24 books of the Odyssey is told to us, the story of Proteus is told to us by Menelaus. Remember that Menelaus was one of the 2 leading Achaeans at the Trojan War on the side of the Achaeans against the Trojans. He was the king, brother of Agamemnon, who was war chief, whose wife Helen was first stolen by Paris of Troy. He's also renowned for having red hair, which comes up very obliquely in this text. On his way back from Troy, Menelaus had a difficult time getting home like Odysseus, but it took him something like 7 years rather than 10 years. While he was trying to make it home, the gods turned the winds against him because of a sacrifice that was not made, and he ends up off the coast of Egypt, a little bit far from Greece, on an island named Pharos. There he meets a daughter of the god Proteus, who tells him that the only way he will ever get home is if he slays 2 or 3 seals, and then he and his men, seals smell terrible, by the way. If you were San Diegans, we would talk about this. My first students said, "Oh, La Jolla, it smells terrible because of the seals." It was funny for me to hear that. But these 3 men have to hide under the seals. When Proteus comes out of the water to count his seals, they need to jump on him and grab him and hold him no matter what. Why? Because when he has been grasped, It transforms over and over and over. Water, a lion, several predatory beasts, fire as well. Proteus seems to be something like, these are very different, though there are similarities, something like the power of the imagination to form and reform, or the power of the intellect. And the power of the intellect here would be using the imagination to transform and connect. If you think about this sort of using clever linguistic cues, Proteus seems like something that is both physical and intangible. We say that you can grasp physical things with your hands, but we also say that you can grasp what with your minds? Intangible things. What sorts of things do you get it? Do you grasp what I am saying? Are you picking up what I'm laying down? These are all terms for what? What is it that you're supposed to have that you grasped? And where is it? Have you ever grasped a concept? Right, a concept, an idea, to grasp something. Proteus seems to be something that can transform, but can ultimately be held if you can maintain, if you can hold it through all of its transformation. So maybe also Proteus could be something like truth. Truth takes many forms in this world. That'd be 2 + 2 = 4. 4 looks very different from the fact that a goat has 2 horns. And yet those are both truths, perhaps not eternal truths. In any case, how does the actual place, and here's the one thing, here's the most important thing. Why catch Proteus? What is it that he will do for Menelaus? He will tell Menelaus the truth. Proteus, if he can be caught, will tell you anything that you want to hear. And yet, something that Proteus also conveys is that the thing that you most want to hear is often the thing that you least want to hear. The truth, as much as one wants to know it, is often bitter in its taste rather than sweet. And so, as Stephen is walking down the sands, think of the sands themselves. Sand is itself a substance that lends itself to transformation. Sand castles and the ease with which one can form, but also think about what he's doing. He's thinking, he's imagining. Ineluctable modality of the visible. Ineluctable modality of the audible. Nacheinander, Nebeneinander. Nacheinander in German means after another. Nebeneinander means alongside another. These are the 2 modalities by which one receives sense perception in this text. One thing at a time, like how one listens. One can hear basically 1 note at a time, otherwise it's sort of a squelched note. Think of somebody banging on a piano. But then Nebeneinander, right next to each other, sight and see many things at once. This chapter is about how one transforms one's sense experience that one sees and hears in one's imagination, and then derives reflected truths from those. As Stephen thinks about Aristotle and those Maimonides and Averroes, and then thinks about their own Aristotelian idea of God, thought, thinking, thought. It was undoubtedly taught to him through the scholastic tradition by the Jesuits at his boarding school. He is thinking about how one transforms one's experience into the thoughts that one has. How does one take what one sees and then transform that into understanding of the world around one? How does one, especially as a young person, take everything that you have experienced and then turn it into something valuable, a map of the world that can guide you to what you want? And in fact, if Proteus is to be taken seriously, a map to what you want to know, but will that ultimately be something that is sweet to know or terribly bitter? One might say that the ultimate truth that humans learn, the fact of their own mortality, is the most bitter of truths that one can learn. And yet, perhaps that is enlightenment. In any case, Stephen is walking alone, having worked his day as a teacher till 10 a.m., nice long day of his, and has been exiled from his home by Haynes, the Englishman, and Bob Mulligan, his voicer to remain. Remember that he gave his key away at the end and said, usurper at the very last word of chapter 1. He is in his own head, thinking, imagining, transforming the images of the day, and yet quite a bit more than just the images of the day, the images and the sense experiences and the knowledge that he has acquired over the entirety of his life. When you go for a walk, don't you carry your entire self with you, like a turtle? Though not physical, Although you do carry physical things, the trauma psychologists will tell us as well. He even imagines his father imitating and making fun of his Aunt Sally from his mother's side. Very embarrassed. This actually comes from Joyce's own life. His father looked down on the family lineage of his mother's side, something very much a family thing that happens. And there are two levels of abstraction from the narrative itself. Okay, great. One note that is made by a great Joyce scholar, whose name is not occurring to me right now, but does do some excellent lectures on Ulysses, is that this chapter is probably responsible for knocking most people off of the endeavor of reading Ulysses, because it is so difficult. So if you've made it through 3, if you thought 3 was particularly difficult, you are in excellent company. Here's Guernica, by the way, that I mentioned, the Picasso piece that shows a battle and everything that's happening there, and is also an excellent representation of the fractured perspective of modernism. You see how there's actually a pretty good explanation for why it looks like this. You notice the two-eyed sort of bull. Note that is also an image of perspective, because you never see somebody sideways in profile, as we call it, in both of their eyes at the same time. It's odd. But you see how heads and limbs and legs are all scattered around? Why do you think that is? Just to show the art? I mean, especially look at this fella. Kind of looks like what happened to him. Kind of looks like what happened in the middle of this painting. Does it look like a bomb went off in the middle of it? Because that is what it's representing. Fractionation of both bodies and psyches due to bombs going on in war. It's supposed to be grotesque. It's supposed to be horrifying. It's supposed to look wrong to you. Because that is what the artist is telling you. Something tremendously wrong has occurred. And this is the result. Perhaps that's also what James Joyce is telling us through this work that he started, that he bases in 1904, but doesn't finish until 1922 after the Great War. And you should know, World War I was not called World War I really until World War II it occurred. It's called the Great War, Magnus Bellum, in any case. Chapter 4, we transition from the first part of the book, the Telemachia, or the Telemachiad, and the perspective of Telemachus, to the next 12 books, chapters 4 to 15, which follow Leopold Bloom. Leopold Bloom, 38, not 21, like Stephen Daedalus, not an intellectual, but an intelligent guy. Something you might see him as is eminently practical. And he's got a lot of sympathy and empathy. When he hears about Mira Purefoy going through labor for 3 days, first thing he thinks is, that's terrible. That's terrible for her. And he goes to check on her later. You go to check on somebody, and this is something that you will, I think, sadly learn during the course of your life. As many friends as you have, people that will actually check on you often are many fewer than what one might imagine. You might even see this in the number of people that contact you on your birthday as you age. The group, maybe at its largest right now. I should hope it's very large at this point. And yet, it will undoubtedly shrink. And so, Bloom is often thinking about the things that he has to do and the people in his life rather than simply major concepts constantly. But we will find during the course of the day that he is fairly well read, that he has a quite the vocabulary as well. He does know the word metempsychosis and then translates it into transmigration of the soul, and then eventually translates that into reincarnation. Those are all very fancy $10 words. Maybe metempsychosis, $50. And so he's also employed doing the job that he wants as an advertiser, and apparently does not need to go to Reuben J., the local Jewish moneylender with a hunch back, because he keeps account of his pennies. He is a fastidious and prudent individual. How he will negatively be seen by this is that he is fastidious and that he takes from others and only focuses on himself. And yet, as you read through this, you will see that that is certainly an incorrect perception of him. He is fastidious and prudent so that he can help other individuals. If one is a drug addict, probably the most important thing that one can do is to try and get over one's own addiction and then help other people. Not to ignore, say, one's own addiction and then help other people. How could Bloom actually be sympathetic and show empathy or sympathy? Empathy is when you feel the same thing as someone else. Sympathy is when you feel bad for what they're feeling. How could he truly show sympathy or act on sympathy if he did not have his own affairs? How is Stephen, we extend this question, how is Stephen ever going to write about the soul of his people if he doesn't understand himself first? Isn't he an Irish person? Where should one start? With the world? Fixing it? Or that tiny insignificant speck that one might seem to be in relation to? Bloom is somebody that has answered this question. His answer is to do his best every day, to do his thing every day, to enjoy the everyday. So something you'll also notice about him is that he enjoys the everyday. He likes the smell of the food that he's cooking. He likes to cook. He likes to go out to the grocery store and get food. He is by no means ethnically Jewish in that he maintains Jewish dietary conventions. He eats pig. The first thing we see him eat is roast pork kidney. And so he also enjoys his drink as well, but he is not a lush like some of the people around him, like Paddy Dignam, who is known for having the drunkard's red nose. Oh, poor Paddy Dignam, he died out of nowhere. And yet the subtext is that he certainly didn't die out of nowhere. We know why he died. He was in the bar, he was a barfly. But Bloom, again, perhaps like Odysseus knowing moderation or temperance. When he has a drink, there's a quote said about Bloom. When he's asked if he wants a drink, he pulls out his pocket watch. He pulls out his pocket watch. The answer is yes, if, which is the prudent person's answer, right? The barfly says yes, no matter what. Doesn't matter what they're doing. But he says yes, if. Why did he pull out his watch? If somebody pulls out their watch after you ask them to do something, what is the thing that would keep them from doing what you asked them to do? Some other obligation that they know that they have. So if he has the time, he will drink the wine, but he has to have the time. You might see this as a key difference between him and someone like a Paddy Dignam. A quote that I'm not going to necessarily validate it, but that I have heard on a recent HBO series is that it's only a problem. This was in relation to a heroin addiction, by the way, if you can't pay for it. I don't necessarily buy that reasoning, but note that Bloom likes to eat and drink like those around him, and yet he is different in how he does it. It is not that he stands apart from drinking. He is not abstinent from drinking, but when he does it, he will do it in a moderate amount. He will often have a fine soda. He'll have a little bit of wine later, not just whiskey like Simon Devilish will have after denying his daughter Dilly that money in order to drink. And also we will find out that he likes clean eating. He doesn't like dirty eating as well. So Bloom is somebody that enjoys sensual things, everyday things, but also has certain restraints that he places on himself. Note that Stephen doesn't seem to have such restraints yet. He's going to get wildly, raucously drunk later. He doesn't bathe very much. He doesn't eat very much either. He has like a piece of bread in the morning, and then he's going to have a liquid lunch. He's going to drink with the newspaper guys, J.J. Malloy, all of them, and then be found, and alongside Buck Mulligan, who will finally have found him and be working on him and trying to get him to waste his money in drunken debauchery, which he will effectively do in this day. And so Stephen and Bloom are very different from each other, and they're perceived in very different ways. And so how is it that one can be Odysseus, so different from Odysseus, one can be Telemachus, so different from Telemachus? All right, these are the first words of chapter 4. Mr. Leopold Bloom ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls. He liked thick giblet soup, nutty gizzards, a stuffed roast heart, liver slices fried with crust crumbs, fried king cod's roes. I don't even know all of this, my goodness. Most of all, he liked grilled mutton kidneys, which gave to his palate a fine tang of faintly scented urine. He says breath smells like, to use a vulgar word for it, smells like piss. Means he has nasty smelling breath, but he doesn't care because, well, A, he's married, but B, he likes his food. So chapter 4 is called Calypso. Calypso in the Odyssey, or this is the 5th book of the Odyssey, lives on an island called Ogygia, an island that is magical and can not be found except by somebody like Ulysses. In fact, Calypso, as a daughter of Atlas, from where we get those things called atlases, who holds up the sky, is cursed always to be alone. And so Odysseus stays with her for 7 years until Athena advocates on his behalf in the royal court of Zeus. And Zeus sends down the messenger Hermes to order Calypso to allow Odysseus to go free and to finally start making his way home after 10 total years. So he's been on the sea for 10 years. 7 of those years he's been on Calypso's island, and she no longer pleases him. She is a beautiful goddess. In fact, brings this up. She says, "Am I less beautiful than your mortal wife?" And Odysseus says, no, but I miss my home very much. And so the Calypso chapter of the Odyssey is where Odysseus goes out, returns to the world from a place of hiding. In this Calypso, Leopold Bloom goes out from his home, out into the world, returns home for a little while, and then goes back out into the home, or out into the world again. A couple things make it to his house while he is gone. 2 letters. One to Mrs. Marion Bloom. We talked about that. It should be to Mrs. Leopold Bloom. That is a bold hand, as described. Blazes Boylan has sent a letter to Molly, a letter that she hides under her pillow when Bloom shows back up. Second letter is from their daughter. I mentioned Rudy, who died 10 years ago, and seems to have been the occasion for the stopping of the marital embrace between Leopold Bloom and Molly Bloom. But they have a daughter, a little bit older than Rudy, who's now in high school. Her name is Millie to Molly, and later Bloom will consider her a watered down version of Molly. It's sort of a rude thing to think of one's daughter, and yet Millie is already finding that there's a young boy attracted to her, and she even says that there was a song put on by Blazes. She almost said Blazes Boylan, give my best to Blazes Boylan. So we see that now we see a connection between Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus. In the same way that Stephen Dedalus is being exiled from his home, the Martello Tower, we see that Bloom is being replaced and having his position usurped in the marital bed today by Blazes Boylan, but also in the heart of his own daughter, because she thinks, give my best to Blazes Boylan. But not only that, who is the great replacer of the father in a young girl's life to the father? Well, the husband would be the traditional one, but she's not yet ready for a husband. She's going to have a boyfriend. And so all of a sudden, the man in her life will no longer be Leopold Bloom, but whoever this young man happens to be. And so we see that Bloom on this day, his relationship to the people most essential to him in his life is being usurped by others. All right, let's see. I mentioned that he's very different from Stephen, but also is similar in that he's very smart. He's less of a speculative thinker, not constantly thinking about the nature of God. He will talk about that a little bit with Stephen. They will have a little bit of a debate in chapter 17 that we are privy to. But it's mostly thinking about how to figure out actual problems. He forgets his key. He doesn't, yes, there's another thing that he does. Patty Dignam, who the people in the Hades chapter, chapter 6, when Leopold Bloom is with them, they're indulging in sadness. They're talking about, oh, how could Patty die? He was the best of us. He's obviously not the best of them in any way, but he had taken out a loan on his death insurance. It's sort of like taking out a mortgage on your house. Any of you understand the complexities of that yet, and those sorts of things? You will. At some point, I mean, I think I managed something like 6 different sorts of insurances right now. Your life will become full of these things. Patty Bignum had a death insurance, but he took out a loan against it. Now there is some question with his wife and his family left, his wife who cannot work. How much money are they going to get after he's died? This is a deadly essential question. This is the same sort of question that Simon Dedalus is running up against with his 12 children still at home, and that he does not have an answer to. Well, who is going to try and fight to get the full insurance amount to the late Mrs. Dignam? It will be Leopold. And so he goes around to Purefoy, looks into her situation. He tries to help the late Patty Dignam's widow. He will also help Stephen Dedalus out when he is dead drunk and is abandoned by his friends in a place called Knightstown later in the text. So I wish to give you these facts about the things that Leopold Bloom is spending his day doing, so you can hedge them against the perceptions that the characters within the novel themselves hold of him, and the askance glances that they give to him, looking out of the side of their eyes, traditional way of expressing distrust, right? When you side eye someone. Dogs are going to side eye. In any case, today he will negotiate. He'll negotiate at work in order to try and get an ad for Alexander Keys. It will be a play on words. There are going to be 2 keys for Alexander Keys. He visits the National Museum where he looks at Venus Callipygian. Callipygian is an extremely sophisticated word for nice butt or pretty butt. He actually looks at her mesial groove, which is the butt crack, in order to see whether she is anatomically perfect. So what is it that he's looking for? Well, he's looking for something. Buck Mulligan, of course, is the one who catches him doing this. He's got an eye for that sort of thing. And then he eventually meets Stephen. He mentioned Molly and Don Giovanni. One of the songs that Molly is going to be singing, Love's Old Sweet Song, and also La Chida Rem Damano. I know I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. La Chida Rem Damano is a song that is being sung first by Don Giovanni and then by Zerlina, the woman that he's seducing. And she responds in a refrain, vorrei e non vorrei. Vorrei is the conditional of voglio, to will. So I will would be voglio, but vorrei means I would like and I would not like. She's vacillating between staying with the man she's about to marry named Mazzetto, or going with this highfalutin Don, right? You might see Molly as making or having made the same choice. There's this everyday Bloom, and there's this fine straw-hatted tan shoe wearing rose in his mouth, blazes boiling, even his name blazes. So those are just some of the essential similarities and differences that we are going to get into ad infinitum over the next few classes. All right, thank you, everybody.